I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but during the wartime and when there wasn't too much going on in town, but the town almost tripled in size. So my mother and my dad was the chief of police in Tooele at the time. And so he would come home and have dinner, and then he'd go back to work until about 9 o'clock at night. So Mom and I would sometimes just get in the car and park up on Main Street and watch all the people going in and out of the stores. And sometimes we'd buy an ice cream cone and sit in the car and watch. And so we were sitting out in front of the drugstore this night where we bought an ice cream cone and was sitting in the car. And Gus had called me several times for a date because we had met at a picnic that my office had planned for up in one of the canyons. And one of the girls that worked with me had a date with Gus. And so they invited some of the officers. And so this girl that worked with me said, she said, since the officers were invited, she said, I'm dating Officer Mandarino. So she said, I'll just be with him. But I was on the dessert table, so I was on the dessert table, and that's all we had was cut up cantaloupe. And so I was a natural blonde in those days, and Gus came up and he said, he picked up some cantaloupe on a paper plate, and he said, do you have any sugar? And I looked very perplexed, and I said, sugar? What do you want sugar for? He said, well, where I come from, we eat sugar on our cantaloupe. And I said, well, where are you from? And he said, I live in a town named Arlington, just out of Boston, Massachusetts. And I said, that is really weird because out here we eat salt on our cantaloupe. And he said, and I thought I was weird. So he went back to his date and who was also with my boss, who was a woman, and her date. And so he said to her, who's that blonde? I'd really like to date her. And so she gave him my telephone number. So he kept calling me and kept calling me. And I said, I was engaged to a kid that I had known when we lived in Ophir and always double dated. And he had gone into the Army, came home on furlough, and we got engaged. But my mother was in California, and my dad was very upset that I accepted the diamond without asking him. So he went overseas anyway. And then Gus kept calling me, and we were in front of the store that night, eating the ice cream cone in the car, when Gus happened to come out of the store, and he had his overseas cap, we called it, instead of his dress hat on. And Gus had quite a large nose. So he come out, and I said, oh, Mom, that's Officer Mandarino. And she swearing. I said, the guy with the big nose, can you imagine me dating him? And she said, Betty, you can't judge a book by its cover. He might be the nicest guy in the world, you never know. So he kept calling me. He didn't even see me in the car that night. And so Mom said, Betty, one date is not going to hurt. And one date led to others. But one day he called to see if he could come over that night. And I had just received word that the kid that I had been engaged to had been killed in action over in Pacific War Zone. And so I was really quite upset. So Gus called to see, and my mother told him what happened. She answered the phone. And he said, I'm going to talk to my captain. He said, and borrow the priest's car. that was he was a serviceman, but he was a priest. And he said, so tell Betty I'm coming over to see her. And Gus was always really a loud person, but boy, he had a soft heart. And when he heard about the kid that I was engaged to had been killed, he got permission to come over. And he said to my mother, I'm going to take Betty for a ride. So he said, okay, Betty, while I drive around, he said, I'm going to ask you questions, and you can answer them or not. But he said, you've got to talk about this. So then we pulled over at the side of one of the streets, and so we talked for a long time. And so he was very compassionate, and I think he helped me get over that because it was quite a shock to me. And so from then on, we started going steady. And it wasn't very much longer that the major that was over him didn't think, because Gus was a Catholic, I was a Mormon, that we should be dating. So he would confine Gus to camp, but he couldn't keep me off. So my boss and her, she was dating a very good friend of Gus's. They were close. So they would come and pick me up and take me down, and then we would just sit and talk and visit in the day room. And when the colonel that was over Gus got word of that, he said, well, I'm telling you, Gus, I'm going to break it up. And we found out later he was an atheist. And he didn't think a Catholic and a Mormon should date. So he cut orders for Gus to be transferred to California. So Gus came up and told us, and he said to me, Betty, I really want to marry you. Will you marry me? I said, not unless you ask my father's permission. And Dad had been out doing yard work, and he came in and he said, Gus, do you know your car's got a flat tire? He said, I will help you change it. So Gus says, okay. So they went out. And it was when they were pumping up the car to change the tire, Mr. Smith, he said, I asked Betty to marry me. And he said, she said yes, she wanted to, but I had to ask you for permission. And so Dad said, well, let's get this tire changed, and then we'll go in and we'll talk to her mother and to her. So we had quite a conversation about the religion, but Gus had already told me because we almost broke up one night. And I got up as far as he said, well, you would have to sign to raise the kids Catholic. I said, Gus, I can't do that because I have a strong testimony that I'm got the right church. And he said, well, I don't know what we're going to do about it. And I said, well, I do. And I opened the car door, got out, and I said goodbye, and got up as far as the front door, was just so. He said, wait a minute, Betty. He said, we've got to talk a little more. He said, I've dated a lot of girls, but I've never really fallen in love. And he said, I asked you to marry me. And he said, I want to marry you. And I promise you that you can raise the kids in your church. But I'll tell you right now, we're going to be living in my hometown, in my house, when I first get home. And it's right around the corner from St. Agnes Church down on Mystic Street here. And he said, if you don't raise the kids Catholic or Mormon, I will take them to that church. And I said, okay. But he didn't realize that I got my mother and we started calling. The bishop helped find, and we found out there was a branch on Brattle Street. And that's where there was two houses side by side. One was a house that we met in for Sunday meetings, and the other house was a mission home. And they were right across from the Longfellow home, and also they faced Brattle Street. But when the church had bought that land from Salt Lake, and so they figured the growth, and then that's why they tore down both of those homes and built the chapel there.